Welcome everyone to day 2 of the ClimateTech Founders Summit, an event hosted by 1014 in collaboration with Impact Hustlers and supported by some really powerful partners that have supported this. Change Now have supported this event a lot. We heard Santiago, the founder of Change Now, speak yesterday. And also supported by Visualizing Ideas for the tech support. Thank you very much for you guys in the background, as well as X and Y, where I'm based right now here in London in the UK. Yesterday has been a really inspiring day for all of us. We just had a chat between Ben, Katya, and myself on kind of reviewing a little bit on what happened yesterday and how great it was to kind of get so many entrepreneurs and founders in the climate tech ecosystem to share what they're working on, connect to each other. I saw loads of you connecting to each other in the networking sessions in the afternoon or wherever you are in the world, and also getting people from actually Australia to Hong Kong to the US to all over Europe join us. It's really amazing to see the ecosystem grow. Again, I mentioned yesterday, this was just a brainstorm and an idea a few months ago when Ben and myself were on calls thinking about what we could do together. And this is just the beginning, I would say. And I'm sure we're going to do very much more similar events like this and initiatives like this to support founders in the space. So with that, I'd love to open the second day and maybe briefly mention just roughly what you can expect today from us without getting into too much detail. Today, the big theme of the day is really partnerships and investment, especially around how to work with corporates and how to work with investors, but also what are the challenges for those corporates and investors in terms of making a real impact in the climate tech space. And in a minute, we have Martin Rich, the founder of Future Fit Business, join us to share a little bit more about how they are using benchmarking to help corporates and investors become net positive, and we'll talk about what that means. We do have Chante Harris, the Director for Climate Investments and Partnerships, on the schedule. We're currently waiting for her to join us. She's unfortunately slightly delayed, and we'll hope that she'll join us very shortly. But we'll get things kicked off before that. And then afterwards, we have our panel with a range of interesting people from across the UK, Germany, and the US. So we have Kayalan Akins-Irby, the head of partnerships at Planet Forward, who will be talking about how they are partnering with companies to help them become carbon neutral. We have Pete Denny, who is an investor at Potential Climate Ventures, climate tech fund that has just been established here in the UK. They've just raised the funding and they're looking to deploy it. If you're a company, especially based in the UK or Europe, you should talk to Pete, definitely. And we'll have Lubomila Jordanova, who's the CEO and founder of Plan A, who basically have developed a carbon accounting framework and working with a range of big corporates. So after that, we have a bunch of co-creation sessions and founders coming onto stage to share what they're doing. And this is the opportunity to get the support they need from all of you, from the audience. So it's really time to brainstorm together. And we'll wrap up the day at the end of the day. We're on Clubhouse, hosted by the Climate Tech Club, which we're really grateful for. We had a good chat yesterday with both people that attended the summit, as well as those that joined from the Climate Tech Club. So with that, I'd love to hand over to Ben from 1014 to talk a little bit more about 1014 in general and why we're doing this together. And then we'll kick off the first session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. It's really great that we're doing this. And as you said, this has really just been a bit of a brainstorming and an idea just a few months ago. And it really is the start of something else. Now we've had over 300 people registering. There is obviously a big international demand, and really to work on this connecting point between companies that work in the climate tech field and that do something around climate sustainability, just these huge and important topics of our time and bringing them together with investors in that field, but also fostering partnerships among these groups and international partnerships. I'm a program officer for 1014. We're a nonprofit based here in New York City, and we really try to create platforms for people working on the big challenges of our times, international platforms. We work together with Europe, with the US, but also worldwide. And that's why I'm really glad that we reached this audience from what I know and what I can see. So that's fantastic. And also to work with such an international crowd like this, which actually doesn't really know borders that much anymore. I mean, that would be another interesting topic on how much borders and local policies matter in this field. But really, like, you are all very used to working internationally and really fostering that exchange whenever it becomes useful for your companies and for your for your ideas and to fostering those. So I'm really glad that you're all joining us on the second day of this conference. You might have been here yesterday. We've had a fantastic morning with 2 different panels. We've had co-creation sessions and then finished off the day with kind of a daily recap on Clubhouse, which we'll do again today. And just a few words on what we do, and I've mentioned it before, but 1014 really tries to be a space for ideas with a space here in New York City, but also digitally and in cooperation with other organizations. We work in the field of business, but also culture and arts and policy and politics. That's just a few of the broad topics. We're really trying to tackle the big major challenges of our time and really see that there's some more international cooperation and that people come together who might not have like met each other before. So this is really an event for you. Please use the sessions and try to make some contacts. We're all on LinkedIn, I think, and it would be great to stay in touch and also see some of you back again for maybe a second event similar to this or like this. So really great to have all of you here, and let's kick off the second day of the ClimateTech Founders Summit today. I wish all of us a great session or a few great sessions and great exchanges. And I want to thank again Michael Schaffrath of Impact Hustlers for organizing and conceptualizing this fantastic summit. Also to Change Now and all the other supporters, and thanks to all of you for participating.
Thank you, Ben. And I see Chante just joined us. Great. Some technical issues there, but it's great to have you on stage, Chante, in a second. And thanks for Ben for joining us. We'll see you a little bit later again.
Great.
With that, I'd love to introduce the first session. Hey, Chante. Sorry for the technical glitches. We got everybody on stage now. Chante Harris and Martin Rich. I'll give a brief introduction to our session, and then we'll kick things off straight away and go from there. So the theme of the day today is really around partnerships and investment. We have about 300 founders and ecosystem leaders that are joining us across those 2 days. And a lot of chat has already happened between the founders and the audience on topics of investment, how to attract customers. So it feels like partnerships with corporates and investment are probably some of the biggest themes for any founder out there to try to crack, especially at the early stages when maybe you're trying to generate traction, you want to partner with corporates, but you're also in the early days. So I'm excited to have really 2 exciting speakers on this topic. Chante Harris, who's the Director of Climate Investments and Partnerships, and also leading on venture for ClimateTech. So excited to learn more about that. Venture for ClimateTech is an acceleration program, and they've been supporting climate tech startups quite a bit already. We'll get more into that in a second. And Martin Rich is the founder of Future Fit Business, which has developed a benchmarking framework that helps both corporates but also institutional investors figure out how they can have a net positive impact on the world, and not just in climate tech, but across a bunch of variables. And I'd be keen to learn more on how they're doing that. And I think both of them will be sharing a bunch of advice for founders as well. So if you're a founder, stay tuned for that. So with that, welcome, Chante, great to have you here. Maybe you want to give a little bit more of a detailed introduction on what got you into climate tech initially, and how are you currently supporting climate tech companies at Venture for Climate Tech?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I love talking to founders. That's at the heart of everything that we should be thinking about, I think, on the investment and the corporate side. So just really amazed by all the founders that have jumped into this space and really want to build solutions that can help solve the climate crisis. I entered into climate tech, I guess, by mistake, to be honest. I was doing sustainability work for years before really anyone was talking about infrastructure or the built environment or waste and how do you upcycle that, particularly in urban environments. And so all of a sudden now what I do is cool. So that's been exciting to have folks say, wow, you work in infrastructure, you work in the built environment. Can you tell me more? I've never seen that amount of excitement around those topics. So yeah, I've spent most of my career working across sectors. Started out in the Obama administration, actually driving economic development policy. It was a really interesting time for workforce development conversations around green jobs. I don't know if folks probably know of Donnell Bard, who runs Block Power, but he was also part of that era where we were just really excited about everything that was happening in the climate space. And I think really just starting to think through policies that could drive innovation and certainly the deployment of technology. So yeah, I did every political wonky thing you could think there, decided that I wanted to be more on the ground and sort of see how can we implement technologies. That led me to New York. And yeah, I worked at an urban strategy firm and launched our first climate and sustainability practice and just fell in love with the space, particularly because I saw the real applications for communities, but also the need for deployment of these technologies and strategy around that. So spent several years doing go-to-market strategy for global corporations, and that turned into growth stage and early stage startups. And then I decided to come to the investment side of things because I thought we could do better in terms of how we invested in these technologies and how we really supported them in terms of scaling. So yeah, here I am. We've been running the Venture for Climate Tech studio really for about a year now, and our founders are ending their time with us and moving into sort of the next stage of how they'll scale. And I lead on, as you mentioned, climate investment and partnerships. So a lot of ecosystem work and really supporting investors who are new to this space. We can get into all the details and how much it's grown since I joined, but just really excited to be here today.
Okay, Martin, a quick intro from your side.
Sure. And again, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with everybody. It is a joy to talk to fellow founders. This can be a long, hard, and often lonely road. So I think it's great to share the experiences with each other as we go along. Likewise, I kind of fell into this space, albeit from a very different perspective. I'm not a political wonk at all. I have great respect, Chante, for anybody who can walk those corridors. That's definitely not my thing. I'm an engineer by training, so I'm a solution builder. I like to see problems. I like to take things apart and then put them back together, and sometimes they work. So I was an investment banker out of university. So I spent 13 years working in derivative risk management for big corporations. Worked at JP Morgan and UBS and HSBC. And through that began to get interested in sort of the early days of what we'd now call climate finance. The 2008 subprime crisis came along, and that sort of gave me the impetus to move out of that space and to discover the social impact investment market space. And I thought, wow, what a great opportunity to take the skills and structuring and experience that I've got and use it for good. ICB sort of trying to fund social enterprises, fund charities, fund things with a purpose, but using repayable capital. So I was involved in the very early days of social impact bonds and things like that when they sort of first came along in their latest iteration. And all of that led to me founding FutureFit. FutureFit Foundation is the organization. FutureFit Business is what we're about creating. And the idea behind FutureFit is that if we are to really tackle the major problems of climate change, social injustice and inequality, then we really need to change the behavior of every company, and we need to direct the mainstream capital flows toward those companies who are committed to making that change and away from those that will not. But to do that, we need to understand what good and bad really looks like. What is harmful activity? What is regenerative activity? What does all of that really mean? Everybody labels things around the Sustainable Development Goals, but again, what does it mean? What our framework does, and I won't go into details now, but what it does is basically use system science to define the line in the sand, beyond which you are regenerative and doing good, below which you're causing harm. We can dig into that more later, Maiko, if you'd like, but that's what we do. We now propagate that open source framework around the world for people to use.
Amazing. Thanks very much for the introduction. I think in your work, you're both covering such a breadth of experience in your past, but also in terms of what you're working on right now. And I'd love to kind of find some commonalities and some thesis around that. I think one point I want to pick up from you, Martin, is around draw a line in the sand. Like, what does it actually mean to be a good company, right? And the role of benchmarking. And we've recorded a podcast before for Impact Hustlers,
yep.
So I know you're thinking a little bit on that, which I think is exactly the type of radical thinking that needs to be there. I think this kind of ESG paradigm of making things a little bit better or making companies do a little bit less harm is kind of thing of the past. And there's really a need now for some really clear standards. Like, you got to be there, or you're basically still having a negative impact on social or environmental factors.
Yeah.
What's your view on kind of that that point? Like, how radical do we have to be, and how do we get corporates and investors to catch up with that? And then maybe following up on that, Chante, on your work, I think, again, with Venture for Climate Tech, you're focused on impactful solutions, right? You're not focused on greenwashing or anything like that. Like, how do you make sure you're pushing for maximum impact in those ventures that are in your programs, while also these companies also need to make money in the short term and need to kind of solve this equation, right? So starting with Martin this time, maybe.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, we need to be incredibly radical if we are going to actually shift the economy where it needs to be. We have built a system that is fundamentally broken. And incrementalism, which is what rules at the moment, I wish you were right, Maiko, that the days of that have gone. The problem is the days of that are still very firmly here. We know their days are numbered, or we hope they are. But incremental change, carrying on as we're doing, people thinking, oh, you know, it's okay. We can reduce the amount of smoke coming out of our chimneys. We can kind of slowly increase the diversity of our boards, whatever it might be. You know, this is not going to get us anywhere where we need to be, because we're moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. We're trying to fix a system that is fundamentally broken. The socioeconomic system is driving GDP creation, gross domestic product, right? Even when that was first introduced, right? The economists who created the concept of GDP said, do not use this to define true growth. And what did the world do? They ignored him and carried on, and then used it for that. Politicians, business people around the world, central bankers, they focus on GDP. Danilo Meadows, the great systems thinker, said, if we create a system, I'm paraphrasing, if we create a system that targets and focuses on maximizing GDP, that's what we will get. We will not get equality. We will not get justice. We will not get efficiency, whatever we want, because that's not the goal of the system. We need to radically change the goal of the system. We need to re-envisage and see business as the servant of the people, not the other way around. Business is what enables us all to live flourishing lives, or should. Money is a tool that flows around that system and should help that system to work well. The pursuit of money for money's sake, the pursuit of GDP, maximization and usage of resources around the world for the benefit of a few, takes us down the road we are already going. That simply is not sustainable. It's not sustainable morally, ethically, and as a global community. nor is it from a science perspective. We are breaching the planetary boundaries. We are destroying the planet. We are tearing our social fabric apart. So even if you don't agree with the moral or ethical view here and think, oh, I don't care about any of that stuff, it simply will not work anyway. We have an exponential growth model in a finite world. We're already blowing through the limits. Things are beginning to go very badly wrong around the world because we're just exploding the system that we're living within. So we have to radically rethink. And with that, I'll hand over to Chante.
Yeah, what's the role of radicalism in your programs or in the ventures that you're supporting, and how do we maximize them?
Yeah, I mean, I think building off of Martin's, I think just well stated, right, argument of, I've seen a huge shift over the past few years. And that when I started doing this work and really, you know, we talk about ESG, it's essentially making the argument that at the core of every business, there should be a through line, right, of what is it causing in the environment? How is it impacting people, right, on a day to day? And then what does it look like also from, you know, the leadership standpoint? Like, what are the values of the leadership? How is that communicated in the decisions that are made, and the board, you know, that not only is selected, but then their involvement in the decisions around the business? And I think what I have seen over the past few years, and it certainly is not enough, but it is, I think, a right step or step in the right direction, is that, you know, corporates are finally seeing that the siloed divisions that they have internally will no longer work. That people expect more of them. And when I was, you know, working with whether it be startups or just innovative solutions and saying, hey, actually, you know, we were still calling it CSR at that point. Now it's social impact. So your social impact division, there's an application for that, right? There's also an application for your sustainability division. And there's also an application for your diversity, equity, and inclusion space. But the reality is that there wasn't that interconnectedness in the strategy and the approach. I think there still isn't to a large extent, but we see those conversations finally happening. We see the merging of those divisions, or at the very least, a team whose responsibility it is to start communicating across all of those teams to say, hey, actually, all of this is interconnected. And if we're going to build a real not only business model, but social impact strategy across our company, then it can't be, you know, DEI is over here, sustainability is over here, our social impact and our giving is over here. And I think that was just not, you know, 5-6 years ago, that was not the conversation we were having at all. And so I really am excited by that, but also, you know, it needs to happen faster, right? And there needs to be, I think, not only a strategy approach to it, but I think the reality is that the right talent hasn't been identified to really move the needle internally at these big corporates. And so there's a question of who's the right person or the right team for that role, and how do you actually hire them? And then what is their actual job, right, once they're in there? And how do you actually give them decision-making power and the ability to move the needle on things, not just hire them as a face, but make sure that internally they can actually change the culture. And I think that's not quite where we're at yet. I think that's where we need to be, and we need to get there way faster. And so that brings me to why I decided to go to early stage. I worked with growth stage companies as well, because, my thought was, hey, well, if we can start earlier, right, with these founders and these CEOs and have them build their companies on this core understanding that it cannot be separate, right? That their business model should relate to their environmental impact, it should relate to their social impact, and it should relate to their core values and their culture and ultimately their governance, right? And what we're seeing is that founders want to do that. And I think there's this idea that simply because we've done it one way for so long, to Martin's point, it's not working. We built it this way and it's broken. I think most of the founders that I'm lucky enough to work with, but also in the climate space, are altruistic. They're coming into the space because they want to solve a problem. They want to do it well. They want to create a revenue generating business that can employ people, right? That can create upward economic mobility for communities, particularly communities that are just proportionally impacted by the climate crisis. And so I think, our end, we just see ourselves as giving them the tools and the frameworks to do that. and not saying, hey, only focus on the revenue generation or the technical pieces of the business. Like, yes, that's important, but so is this holistic approach to building your business. And I think we've just embedded that into our model and how we support our companies. We also have a milestone-based approach to funding, and that they actually have to hit key milestones for all of those pieces that I just mentioned in order to access funding. So we're creating an incentive, right? Not only in terms of their financial stability, but I think also in terms of saying, hey, if you're going to succeed in this market, but also if you want to actually create a company that's going to have impact across the board, you need to be thinking about it holistically. And we're going to give you the tools and the frameworks to do that. And, I think that we're at a point where more people are doing that and more founders are wanting that. And I still think that we need more of it, right? We had over 700 ideas submitted in our first year, and we could only support 11 of those and down selected to 9. And the reality is that there's so many other founders out there that want and need the support and have great solutions. So I think it's really a question to the ecosystem of how do we drive the narrative at the earliest stages, right? But then also don't lose sight of how they ultimately have to work with and sell to corporates, right? And so, that's my perspective and how our team is approaching it.
Can I just pick up on some of that, Maiko? Because I think it's just hit so many important points in that, in terms of the embedded nature of doing business differently. And this is the hugely exciting opportunity, because change is hard. Change is really, really hard. Look at some of the big incumbent companies where they've had real believers on top of the organization, and they've been trying to drive change, and how hard that ended up being for them, because there was such a beast that needed feeding. Emmanuel Faber from Danone is quite a sort of a headline example from recent times. There was a chief executive who was really trying to, do a bit of a Paul Polman from Unilever. He was trying to do the same at Danone. He was trying to really radically change, and ultimately got forced out by some activist investors who didn't like the financial performances, etc. So again, you never know the full story from the outside, but you could just see the challenges that gentleman had trying to shift that behemoth. The joy with the tech world today is it's so easy, relatively, to set up a new business, to sort of say, we are going to serve a need radically differently. And a handful of people together with some laptops. Yes, you need backing, you need support, you need entrance, you need, a bit of good luck, all of those things. But actually the ability to just address a problem in a completely different way, and to be saying, what's the social need that we serve, not what's the product we produce or how many units are we shipping, but what's the need that we are serving, and why should our customers want us to succeed? It's just a radically different way of starting. And I truly believe that if we can create a global platform of people running businesses in that way, we actually do have a chance to tackle some of these huge issues.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, right? Even yesterday, some of these topics came up on the role of disruption versus internal change, right? So I started my career actually in a digital transformation in a big corporate, and I just saw even how much they struggled with that, right? I can't imagine how even some sincere leaders, how much they will struggle with bringing about real transformation. And Martin, you see that all the time. I assume it's one thing to tell them how bad they are and where they need to get, but then it's the other thing about getting there, right? So think around the role of disruption? Do we just need to replace those corporates with hyper fast growing tech startups that are replacing those big corporates? It's almost two questions in one, but let's start with the one with do you bet more on disruption, or do you bet more on big players changing themselves, or it's a both at the same time?
I think it's both at the same time, right? The mantra that we tend to go to big companies with now is disrupt yourself before you are disrupted. The inevitability is you will be disrupted. There's no question, right? Whether it's through climate and carbon taxes, whether it's social license to operate, whether it's simply your product becomes redundant and replaced by a radically different solution. Stuff is going to happen. Let's take another big example. Can you imagine the guys at BMW, right, when they were first creating the i3 and the i8, their two first battery cars? I mean, they were probably laughed at by most of the rest of the factory, and probably fairly unanimously disliked, because it's like, well, hang on, what are you doing? You're radically shifting our entire business model. And then on the East Coast of the States, there's this crazy guy started this company called Tesla, and everybody laughed at them and said, we're not going to be that. 2021, everybody now wants to be Tesla. Everybody is radically changed, quickly working out how they get rid of these old internal combustion engines and replace them with, mainly with batteries. Others are looking at, hydrogen or different technologies. Everybody's now scrambling to catch up. Well done to the guys who got in there first. Now, there are other problems associated with that company and those types of cars, but it was a radical disruption that you really could see coming down the tracks that you like a steam train. So you've got to get on the front foot, or you will be disrupted.
Love it. Chante, I'd love your view on that in a second. Just quick one for anybody in the audience. We do have a Q&A tab on the right side, just next to the stage. There's a stage tab you can click on, and then on Q&A, if you want to ask any questions to Martin or Chante, we'll answer them in a little bit as well. But Chante, please go for it.
Yeah, I think disruption, the word disruption has been one that I haven't quite liked over the years. I think particularly thinking about Silicon Valley and just like the thought of like move fast and break things. Like, I think that's what has often come to mind when people think of disruption, at least in the tech space specifically. And I feel like we're finally at a point where we're seeing that just isn't sustainable, particularly, for all businesses, but I think particularly when it comes to climate tech, many of which, the founders that we work with are building solutions that are very technical, that require iterative process when it comes to science, right? It's material science, it's hardware, right? Deep tech, sure, software solutions, but software solutions are working with whether it be big utilities or large industries, right? That many would argue are pretty archaic and haven't had any sort of innovation for decades, right? But still control a large piece of how we experience energy consumption across the globe. And so I think, while I think disruption has other meanings depending on where you say it and sort of what sector you're referring to, I think what I think a lot about is how do we have intention throughout innovation. And so that's what I like to use is let's have intention for how we innovate. And I think whether you're a startup founder, whether you're internally at a big corporate, whether you're working on the investment side of things or leading a government agency, I think we all have to play a role in terms of innovation. And, the nice thing about the team I work with over at Second Muse is we don't see it as sort of one sector, right, is going to solve this issue. The reality is like that's just not possible. We have to all sort of roll up our sleeves and be all in on how we can play a role in moving the needle, whether it be internally or as driving, right, some sort of company or again agency to make sure that we're shifting things so that the technologies, the solutions, the creative ideas that ultimately, yes, should be generating revenue, but really what we're talking about here is preserving the planet, right, and protecting people. And so I think I find that when our team approaches it from that model of how do we actually think about things from a systems design approach, right, from a human design approach, and ensure that people understand their role, because I think sometimes, or not even sometimes, I'd argue that a lot, this is certainly a US perspective, a lot of the times what happens is people sort of get siloed into their specific sector or area and then believe that they're the only folks that are going to solve the issue, right? And that's just not possible, right? We have to be thinking about innovation, intention of innovation across all sectors. And our team is actually leading a design lab right now where we're essentially trying to ask the question, how do we close the gap for early stage funding for climate technologies? And we're not only talking to investors, we're talking to foundations, we're talking to corporates, we're talking to governments as well, because I think, Martin mentioned Tesla, and the interesting about Tesla is Tesla really got its foot footing from, R&D that was sponsored and funded by the government, whether that be the Department of Defense or the Obama administration. That a lot of the ability of Tesla to not only deploy its technologies but continue to build and iterate on its products was funded by the government, right? And so I think this idea that like Silicon Valley is going to save us all from the climate crisis is just not true. It has not ever been true, and it will continue to not be true. And I think the last thing I'll say is it's particularly on the investment side, what we're seeing is a lot more appetite to innovate in ways that we haven't seen on the VC model. And I don't know if folks saw Sequoia's big announcement yesterday about how they're restructuring the way they think about investment. And they literally say, VC has not innovated in the way that it needs to support the innovation of the founders, and that the best companies need a longer time to get to market. And sort of these very strict hard line, 3 to 5 year, we expect X amount of returns in a unicorn is not actually how we're going to build sustainable business. And I think when it comes to climate, we also can't afford to lose at the rate that Silicon Valley has lost in terms of if you look at the percentage of companies that actually survive, that actually are successful, we need all of these companies to survive and be successful because we need them to help mitigate the climate crisis. So.
Love that. One up for you, Chante, and then maybe to Martin on that as well, is with the companies that are part of your programs, what tips are you sharing with them, or can you maybe share with founders in the audience in terms of investment and funding? Because I can imagine very quickly you'll either have to decide, are you going to go down the VC route and are you going to sign up to be a unicorn in 5 years? Or are you basically going for grant funding? Obviously, Martin, you actually established FutureFit as a foundation. That's another model, right? So should you even go the for-profit route or not? But maybe starting with the advice you give to your companies, you said you're doing some work around funding. What's kind of a really good route to go to as a climate tech founder that allows you to also break some existing paradigms and not get caught up in the same way again?
I think that's ultimately still a hard question to answer. I mean, we work with our founders one-on-one and have coached their fundraising journey. I think a part of it is starting with what's the type of company you want to build. I think for some people, the VC model makes sense, right? Either they are a founder that sort of gets energized, right, by like meeting these crazy deadlines and having expectations around their cap table and sort of what it looks like. I think also for some founders, the application of their technologies we know has a proven use case already, right? And so maybe they're innovating the business model, or they've innovated a product that we've already seen go to market and be successful. I think the VC model can have a lot of great applications for those types of technologies and solutions. And I think there are also a lot of companies, particularly in the climate space, where it just doesn't make sense to take VC capital up front. And I think you as a founder have to ask that question of, well, what's the type of company I'm building? Do I have a real proven use case and business model? And so we really focus on customer market fit, understanding your customers, your product market, right? And then building a fundraising strategy that aligns with your understanding of the market and the technology you're building, which I think oftentimes, especially these days, because valuations in the US are just absurd, like it's a totally different ball game now, right? We're seeing just pre-seed companies, right? Like pre-revenue companies raise so much money. And I think one of my really good friends, Taj Eldred, who runs Include Ventures, he recently spoke to our founders, but also says this all the time when he's speaking. He's like, you shouldn't be celebrating raising VC capital. That's not the win. Once you raise VC, you have to actually go out and use that and not only build traction, but bring in customers and revenue. There's now someone you're beholden to, right? And I think sometimes in the startup space, especially now because of all the buzz around VC, there's like this just overemphasis, I think, on raising capital, when the reality is like, that's just the start. Like that's the starting point. You now have to, you now are expected to bring in certain returns at a certain rate to folks who are now on your cap table and make decisions about your business. And so I think, again, it's for us, we don't just talk about VC. There's a lot of angel syndicates that have popped up, new types of SPVs. There's also new revenue generating models that we're exploring with our founders. There's project finance, debt, there's impact investment. There's the role of just, bootstrapping as well. And so I think We talk about all of them rather than just one or overemphasizing one. In the US, there's a lot of grants as well. And so, that's a huge thing that we encourage our founders to take advantage of, particularly when they're still iterating on their prototype, right? Still figuring out how to build a product that works in the market, because most of our companies are very early stage on the venture for climate tech side.
I think, yeah, building on that, annoying you if you make, I'm just going to agree. Chante, we need to find something to disagree on here. But as an ex-banker and financial structurer, I would always start from the cash flows. And again, a simple example, when social impact bonds were kind of all the rage in the early sort of 2010s, sort of 2011, 12. We get people ringing up all the time saying, I want to do a social impact bond. Okay, cool, great. What's the product? What's the project? And by the time you've gone through it, you'd be like, no, actually, you just want a loan or you want some equity, So saying I want that type of funding is completely the wrong starting place. What is the business model? What are the cash flows you're going to generate? How certain are they? All of that, and then building in these points Chante was making about what is the ethos of the business? What do you as founders want to achieve from this? Is it a for-profit? Is it a maximization of profit? Is it a non-profit? All of these threads need to come together. And then from that, you start to carve out the picture of what the right funding might be. A single version, it might be multiple streams of funding to go across the various pieces. But the more you can align that, the more you align expectations, then the better the journey is going to be. And ultimately, all of these things come with strings attached. If you're going for the VC money, even, I mean, this is amazing. I'll read that Sequoia story. I hadn't heard that. It was amazing if that's, really comes to fruition. But if you're going down, the VC route, they're going to want a lot of ownership. They're going to want a lot of control. And ultimately, if you don't come up to muster on it, then they're probably going to boot you out and replace you with other people. So you could lose your baby. So you got to think about those types of things. And yet there's a lot of money there, which is very, very helpful. The other end of the spectrum where we are in the grant world, we set up as a UK charity because we wanted to create a framework that was open source. We didn't want to say we've created something so good to save the world and now it's in a black box and you can only see it if you pay us $500,000. That's kind of like not the idea. So we went down the charitable route so that we could get people to come in and help co-create this framework, which they did. We had experts and academics and all sorts from, hundreds of them around the world feeding in to our product effectively because they knew it would be open source. But we've always been on a trajectory to try and grow a reliable revenue stream because the grant market is incredibly tough. Grant makers want things for their money. It's not free money. It's free in that you don't need to repay it, but they want stuff delivering. You can very easily find yourself channeled down a route where really you're responding more to what they want than them funding what you're trying to do. They have very narrow funding targets and objectives. If you're in Europe, the amount of grant money available is actually a lot smaller than it is in the US. The US, you guys have it a lot easier, sadly, for us in this regard. And the money can be there one day, the tap is turned off the next day. So be very, very careful. Yeah, it's great money if you can get it in the sense that it's free, you don't have to repay it, but think again about the things that you're signing up for and don't build your dependency on it. But absolutely, the starting point has to come back. What is the model? What are the cash flows you're trying to create over time? How can you align that with your values and the values of those that you're bringing in? Start there, and that gives you the right answer.
Thanks, Martin. We got a few questions coming in from the audience, and I'd love to ask you to keep answers as brief as possible because we do need to wrap up in a few minutes. But we have one question for Chante from Peter, and he's asking, are big name VCs starting to look more favorably on tech for good startups and B Corps? it seems many are scared to become such, fearing that this restricts access to investment. So is this like a good thing to be a B Corp or tech for good startup if you raise from mainstream VC or not?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are VCs that exist that are really looking at, is this model one that has social impact at its core? I think some good examples are Impact Engine, Better VC, Obvious Ventures. I think all of those folks are really looking for models that have a good impact on the world, right? There's another one that I'm blanking. I think it might be 2150. I believe they're based out of the Bay Area. They care deeply as well around mission-oriented business models. I think in relation to the B Corp, it really, to me, because I've had this conversation with our founders, it depends on what stage you're at. I think the reality is like you can always become a B Corp. So I'm not saying don't ever do it, but I think what we've seen in the US is simply because people are still wrapping their head around B Corp as a whole and sort of what the model and the requirements are. The reality is like a lot of VCs still don't take risk. I think people in general, right, in the business world aren't necessarily always, they're not looking to take risks on things that they don't really know much about. And so it can, I think, oftentimes just serve as a barrier because they're not quite sure what it means for you to be a B Corp. And, the question becomes like, is it worth you spending the time explaining to, almost every investor that's not familiar with the model of what that means for your business? In my opinion, probably not. It doesn't mean that you can't still start thinking about like which is what we've talked to our founders about. If you're going to go the B Corp route, what are the requirements, right? How can you start to set yourself up for success so that you're not going to become a B Corp and then realizing like, hey, actually, this is a lot more work, or I would actually need to hire someone, which is not unheard of, to meet these requirements around being a B Corp. I know B Corp, if I'm not mistaken, the last time I was talking to their team and sort of figuring out what they had planned for entrepreneurs is working on, and they may have already launched a specific designation for startups and smaller companies to basically have a certification around the intention to become a B Corp rather than becoming a B Corp at their earlier stages. So I think it really depends on stage. I think if you're still very much at the early stage of fundraising and figuring out how you're going to bring in more revenue, it's probably not worth, in my opinion, you trying to tack on an additional sort of requirement to your business. I do think it's worth, again, sort of building it into the initial model and making sure you're prepared for when you have the revenue and can really, I think, dedicate the time and the capacity towards it, that you're prepared to do so.
Amazing. We have one combined question. I'm going to combine the question from Bert and Sad because they're both asking about fundraising for hardware-driven companies, especially early stage. So Sad is talking about, what kind of funding is available for pre-revenue hardware companies. I think his example is electric vehicle charging. And to add Bert's question on top of that is basically kind of who can fill the critical $1 million seed round, which is usually too much for angels and too little for VCs, especially if you're in hardware and you need that cash to make a difference. Any views on that from either of you? I'm sure Chante has plenty.
Go, Chante.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yes. Those are all good questions. I think those are questions that don't quite have answers, to be honest. I think that's one of the reasons why we're running this lab process, to figure out how can we essentially account for that valley of death that oftentimes happens for companies that are building deep tech and hardware solutions. It doesn't mean that there aren't resources out there. I would say that depending on where you are in your prototype process, looking at labs, I think oftentimes labs will invest in, the R&D, particularly at the earliest stages, so pre-seed, seed, and really helping you connect to customers. I think we're seeing a lot more, again, new types of business models emerging. One good example is Enduring Planet. It's new. Dimitri is working on that based out of the US and trying to fill that gap. And one thing that we've been talking a lot about is the role of philanthropic dollars potentially to help fill this gap. And so that seems to be gaining some momentum. But I would say that while there are some angels and early stage VC firms that are looking at hardware. And I do think in the climate space, we're seeing a lot more appetite for taking some of those risks on because the policy is starting to align and there's a better case for it. It still is a challenge. And so I think someone mentioned EV in particular, we do have a company in our cohort that is building an electric vehicle charging solution. And they have really honestly had to not only go to their social networks, sort of their universities that they went to, but really build out, I think, some of the types of connections with sort of high net worth individuals to get funding, which me even saying that, I'm like, that's not fair, right? That's not what the market should be. It shouldn't be about your social networks and your connections. It should be about your solution and your ability to build a great company. Unfortunately, I don't think that that's the case yet. I'd say also, we are powered by NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Agency. A lot of their funding that they have coming out, whether it be innovation prizes or just similar grant type opportunities, can help support some of that funding, but it is a gap still in the market that I know many folks are just really trying to tap into and solve at this time.
Yeah, not a huge amount really to add. I mean, unfortunately, pretty much every funding route right now has some sort of valley of death in it, and I think anything where you're doing hardware and anything that is heavy asset based up front is really, really tricky. And all I could do is point back really to the previous conversation we were having, saying, you've really got to be factoring that in from day one. How do you build that inventory? What's the, can you bootstrap your way through it in some way, shape or form? Can you use those assets as security? Because the problem is so often the stuff that you're building is very bespoke. So it's like, it costs you a fortune to build it, and then it's worth, 50 cents when you can't use it anymore. So yeah, it is super, super tricky, but it's got to go back to when you're trying to just design that business up from day one, be aware of where those valleys of death are, and do your very best to circumnavigate them. Good questions, and probably the two of you are slightly frustrated that we can't, but neither of us could give you a very clear answer, but it's a super hard area.
Just point out Prime Coalition, because I think the Prime Impact Fund is a really good example of folks who are trying to close that gap. They tend to essentially back founders that would otherwise not be able to have the funding they need to build a great technology, most of the time in a hardware and deep tech space. So if you're not familiar with Prime, highly recommend taking a look at them and their fund. They're raising their second fund right now. They might be closing soon. And I think they're a really good example of what we need more of in the market. And I think that, again, there are people who are recognizing that as well and wanting to do that.
Thank you very much, Chante. Thank you, Martin, for sharing all your insights across such a big spectrum. We have to wrap up now, but really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with the audience. Just to give everybody a quick overview of what's coming next, we're doubling down on this topic and diving even deeper into the themes of investment, but also some tactical strategies of partnering with corporates. And we also have Lubomila Jordanova in the waiting room, joining us very soon. She's the founder and CEO of Plan A, which offers carbon accounting for corporates. We have Pete Denny, who is an investor from Potential Climate Ventures, and Kyalin Arkans-Irby from Planet Forward, who will join us very soon. So we're looking forward to that. We'll see you back on the main stage in just a few minutes. So stick around, network in the chat, and we'll see everybody back here in just a few minutes. Thanks, Chante. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.